I pulled the rental car up to the curb in front of the familiar wooden house in suburban Kentucky, holding a bouquet of lilies and an expensive Mikimoto pearl necklace bought back in Norfolk. For 48 precious hours of leave for Mother's Day, I just wanted to see the smile of the woman I loved most. With $6,000 I transferred regularly on the first of every month for the past year, I imagined Mom living like a queen, the house renovated and the fridge full of food. But when I walked into the kitchen, reality slapped me hard in the face. No smell of baking, no abundance. Only my mother, thin in ragged clothes, trembling as she hurriedly hid a box of stewed beans labeled Church Relief behind her back. She looked at me not with joy, but with sheer terror as if I were a judge passing sentence. "Liana, why did you come back without warning?" she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "Don't tell your father Mom is eating this." My heart shattered. Where had $72,000 of my blood and sweat salary evaporated to? And why, in the very house I was supporting, was my mother living like a beggar? The shock of her words left me paralyzed for a moment, standing there in my pressed slacks and military-issue boots, clutching a velvet box that now felt heavy with irony. I forced my legs to move, stepping fully into the room. The contrast between the life I lived, the disciplined, sterile, high-performance world of the Navy, and the decay rotting around me was violent. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a sound of structural neglect that shouldn't exist in a home fully paid for. The air didn't smell like the lavender candles I used to send money for. It smelled of damp drywall and trapped despair. I set the lilies down on the dining table, the only surface not covered in dust. But as I cleared a space, my hand brushed against a stack of envelopes. They weren't greeting cards, they were aggressive, red-lettered warnings. Kentucky Power, disconnection. Notice: Water Authority, past due, medical collections, final attempt. I picked one up, my fingers trembling with a mix of confusion and rising rage. The amount due was trivial compared to what I sent home. I had transferred enough money to pay these bills 10 times over. I'd sent enough to replace the roof, buy a new HVAC system, and fill the pantry with steaks and fresh produce from Whole Foods. Yet, here was the evidence of financial ruin, staring at me in angry red font. I turned back to the kitchen, where the only light came from a buzzing, flickering fluorescent tube that cast a sickly pallor over everything. My mother, Elaine, was still huddled at the small breakfast table. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had raised me. Her collarbones protruded sharply beneath a housecoat that had been washed so many times the fabric was thinning to transparency. I walked over to her, the sound of my boots echoing too loudly in the silence. I gently reached out and took the object she was trying so desperately to hide. It was a cold can of pork and beans. The label had been partially torn off, but the stamp was unmistakable. First, United Methodist Church Food Pantry. Not for resale. It was cold. She hadn't even warmed it up. There was no meat, no vegetables, no bread, just gelatinous beans in a can. "Mom," I said, my voice dangerously steady, masking the turmoil inside. "I send $6,000 on the first of every month. I have the receipts. Why are you eating charity food?" She looked up at me, her eyes cloudy and confused, blinking as if trying to process a foreign language. "6,000? Oh, honey, no. Your father said the military cut your pay. He told me the economy was bad, that inflation was eating everything up. He said you could barely afford your own rent in Norfolk." She paused, looking down at her hands. "He said we had to tighten our belts, that I needed to do my part to help you keep the house. That's why he takes the disability check too, to manage it for us." The air left my lungs. The lie was so audacious, so complete, it was almost impressive in its cruelty. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, lethal fury. I opened my banking app, authenticated with my Face ID, and navigated to the transfer history. I shoved the screen gently into her line of sight. "Look, Mom, read this." Her eyes scanned the glowing screen. May 1st, transfer to Harold Ellis, $6,000. Status, successful. April 1st, transfer to Harold Ellis, $6,000. Status, successful. March 1st, transfer to Harold Ellis, $6,000. Status, successful. Row after row of green text. $72,000 in 1 year. A fortune in this part of Kentucky. Elaine stared at the numbers. She looked at the date. Then she looked at the cold can of beans sitting on the table. The cognitive dissonance broke, and her face crumbled. Tears spilled over her cheeks, tracking through the grime. He told me we were broke, she sobbed, a sound that was more whimper than cry. He told me the church food was a blessing I should be grateful for. He made me walk there, Liana. He made me stand in line. I felt a physical pain in my chest, sharp and hot. My father hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my mother's dignity. He had forced her to beg for food while he sat on a pile of cash meant for her comfort. But then, the sadness in her eyes shifted instantly to something far worse. Terror. She grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging into my skin. Liana, you can't tell him. You can't let him know you showed me this. What? Mom, he's stealing from us. No, she hissed, her eyes darting to the back door. He gets so angry. He says I'm ungrateful. He says if I question him, I'm sinning against the head of the household. If he finds out I know, he'll make it worse. Please, Liana, hide the phone. I looked down at her, a woman who used to protect me from nightmares, now living in one she couldn't wake up from. This wasn't just poverty, this was a prison. The peeling paint and the cold beans were just the scenery. The real story was the fear in her eyes. I pulled my hand away, my resolve hardening into diamond. I wasn't just a daughter visiting for the weekend anymore. I was an officer who had just identified a hostile threat inside the perimeter. I'm not hiding anything, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register. Just then, the sound of gravel crunching outside broke the silence. The heavy, throaty roar of a large truck engine cut through the humid afternoon air. The enemy wasn't overseas. He was pulling into the driveway. The heavy back door slammed open with enough force to rattle the lone window pane in the kitchen frame. A gust of humid air followed, carrying the pungent, unmistakable stench of stale cigarette smoke and cheap domestic beer. The silence that had enveloped my mother and me was shattered instantly. Harold and Mark Ellis walked in like they owned the world, or at least like they hadn't a care in it. My father, Harold, was a large man, but not in a muscular way. He carried a heavy paunch that strained against the fabric of his shirt. His face flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson from years of high blood pressure and day drinking. But what caught my eye wasn't his health. It was his attire. He was wearing a brand new Columbia PFG fishing shirt, crisp, vented, likely $60 or $70 at the sporting goods store. On his head sat a fresh camouflage trucker hat. Trailing behind him was my brother Mark, 34 years old, unemployed, and currently dragging a massive white Yeti cooler across the linoleum. I knew exactly how much those coolers cost. That was a $300 cooler dragging across a floor that hadn't been replaced since the 90s. The visual contrast made my blood run cold. Here was my mother, skeletal and trembling in a threadbare housecoat, eating charity beans. And there stood the men of the house, looking like they had just won a lottery, smelling of leisure and excess. When Harold saw me standing in the center of the kitchen, the boisterous grin on his face vanished. There was no fatherly warmth, no surprise, no joy. Just a flash of irritation, like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "What the hell are you doing here?" Harold barked, bypassing a greeting entirely. "You didn't call. Who just shows up without calling? You trying to play surprise inspector?" Mark snickered, dropping the heavy cooler with a thud. He leaned against the counter, looking me up and down with a sneer that made my skin crawl. Maybe the Navy finally kicked her out, Pop. Or maybe she couldn't find a husband in Norfolk, so she came crawling back to Mommy's apron strings. I stood at the position of attention instinctively, my spine rigid. These weren't family members. They were hostiles. "The fridge is empty, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through their banter like a knife. "Mom is eating beans from a food pantry. Explain that." Harold scoffed, walking past me to the pantry. He grabbed a fresh beer, popped the tab with a sharp hiss, and took a long, noisy pull. He let out a wet belch, right in front of my mother. "Your mother has gotten weird in her old age," Harold said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. She likes that simple stuff. Says it reminds her of her childhood. Besides, do you have any idea what things cost out here in the real world, Liana? Gas is up, insurance is up. I'm the provider here. I have to manage the resources. Manage the resources, I repeated, my voice rising. I checked the receipts. I have sent $72,000 in the last 12 months. That is enough to buy that brand new Ford F-150 I see parked outside. It is enough to fill this kitchen with food for a decade. Mark laughed, a high mocking sound. Oh, listen to her. The big bad officer thinks she knows how to run a household because she wears a uniform. Harold slammed his beer can down on the table. Foam erupted from the top, splashing onto the table and splattering onto my mother's faded housecoat. Mom flinched violently, shrinking into her chair. I'm sorry, Harold, she whispered, wiping at the beer stain on her ragged clothes. I'm so sorry, I'll clean it up. She was apologizing. For his mess. Something inside me snapped. The sheer audacity, the weaponized incompetence, the absolute cruelty of these two men living like kings on my dime while treating the woman who fed them like a servant, it was suffocating. Don't you dare apologize, Mom, I said through gritted teeth. I turned to Harold. That is my money. I earned it serving this country. I sent it for her. Harold stepped into my personal space, puffing out his chest, using his size to intimidate. It was a tactic that might have worked when I was 12. It didn't work on a lieutenant commander. Don't you come into my house and lecture me about money, little girl, he spat, his breath reeking of alcohol. I gave you life. I raised you. I have every right to use that money however I see fit. You think you're special because you send a check? You're a woman. You don't know how to handle finances. I'm keeping it safe. Otherwise, you just blow it on clothes or give it to some boy. Safe? I gestured to the Yeti cooler, the new truck outside, the fresh clothes. You're spending it on toys while your wife starves. I am the head of this household, Harold roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. And you are a guest. If you don't like how I run things, you can get back in your little rental car and leave. Mark chimed in, patting his father on the back. Yeah, go back to the ocean, sis. Leave the real world to the men. I looked at my mother. She was trembling, her eyes squeezed shut, praying for the shouting to stop. She wasn't going to fight. She couldn't. He had beaten her spirit into submission long ago with years of fear and financial control. I know I'm not the only one whose blood is boiling right now. If you have ever dealt with a family member who takes everything for granted while you do all the work, hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, if you were in my shoes, would you have flipped that table over right then and there? Type yes if you would, because I was about 2 seconds away from losing it. But I didn't flip the table. As I looked at Harold's smug, arrogant face and Mark's foolish grin, I realized that screaming was useless. Logic was useless. They didn't care about morality. They didn't care about suffering. They only cared about the supply. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I needed to think like an officer. Emotional outbursts would just give them ammunition to call me hysterical or crazy. To take down a target this entrenched, I didn't need a shouting match. I needed a paper trail. I needed hard evidence that would stand up not just in a family argument, but in a court of law. Fine, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying calm. You're right, Dad. You're the head of the household. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them confused by my sudden surrender. But I wasn't surrendering. I was just changing tactics. If they wanted to play games with my money, I was going to show them exactly what the cost of war looked like. Tomorrow morning, I wasn't going to be a daughter. I was going to be an investigator. And I knew exactly where to start looking. At 700 hours the next morning, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of rain. I didn't wear civilian clothes. I put on my service khakis, pressing the creases until they were sharp enough to cut glass. I polished my brass belt buckle until it gleamed. If I was going to walk into the center of my childhood community to uncover the truth, I was going to do it with the full weight of my rank and dignity. I drove the rental car to Oak Haven United Methodist Church. It was a red brick building that anchored our small town, the place where I had attended Sunday school, where I had been baptized, and where, apparently, my mother had been reduced to a beggar. The parking lot was empty save for the pastor's sedan. I walked up the steps, the silence of the morning amplified by the rhythmic click of my heels on the pavement. Pastor Reynolds was in his office, a small room that smelled of lemon polish and old, dust-heavy books. He was a gentleman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who had known me since I was tall enough to see over the pew. But when he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, his expression didn't hold the pride I usually saw when I came home in uniform. It held pity. That look hit me harder than a physical blow. In the Navy, pity is an insult. It means you are weak. It means you are a casualty. "Liana," he said softly, standing up to gesture toward a wooden chair. "I heard you were back in town. I'm very glad you're here. Your mother truly needs the help." He busied himself pouring tea from a porcelain pot, his hands moving with a nervous energy that set my radar off immediately. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Pastor," I said, skipping the pleasantries, "my mother is eating beans from your food pantry. She has disconnection notices on her table. I need to know when this started." Reynolds sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire congregation's secrets. He sat down and pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger from his desk drawer. He opened it, running a finger down the handwritten columns. "It started about 14 months ago," he said, his voice grave. "At first, it was just small things. A few boxes of powdered milk, canned vegetables. Then, last winter, Harold came to us about the heating bill. It was $300. We paid it from the emergency fund. We never turn away a family in need, Liana. You know that." "But..." He trailed off, looking at the ledger as if the numbers pained him. "But what?" I pressed, leaning forward. "But we tried to reach out to you," he admitted, finally looking up at me. "I know you are an officer. I know the military pays well. I thought perhaps there was a mistake, a banking error." "There was no error," I said, my voice tight. "I send $6,000 a month. Every month." The pastor's eyes widened behind his glasses. He looked from me to the ledger and then back to me. The pity in his eyes deepened, shifting into something closer to sorrow. "Oh, my dear," he whispered, "that makes what Harold said even more difficult to repeat." "What did he say, Pastor? I need to know." Reynolds took a sip of tea, likely to buy himself a moment of courage. "Last autumn, when the requests for money became frequent, I called your father. I asked him if we should contact you, if the family needed a long-term financial plan. He broke down crying on the phone. I gripped the arms of the wooden chair so hard my knuckles turned white. He cried. "He told me you had cut them off," Reynolds said. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. "He said you were living the high life in the city, spending your money on luxury apartments and vacations. He said you had turned your back on your aging parents and told them to fend for themselves. He said you told him that you didn't owe them a dime." The silence that followed was absolute. My ears rang. It wasn't just theft, it was character assassination. Harold hadn't just stolen $72,000 from me, he had stolen my name. He had painted me as the prodigal, ungrateful daughter to the entire town. He had made himself the victim, the suffering father abandoned by the heartless military officer, also he could garner sympathy and free groceries while he drank beer in a new truck. He allowed my mother to stand in line for handouts, enduring the whispers and the side-eyed glances of her neighbors, while he spent my hard-earned money on his own selfish indulgences. "Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord," the pastor quoted softly, shaking his head. "We approved the emergency funds because we thought they had no one else. We thought they were abandoned." I sat there for a moment, letting the betrayal soak into my bones. It felt cold, like ice water in my veins. But then, the cold turned into armor. The hurt evaporated, replaced by the tactical clarity of a commander surveying a battlefield. Harold had built a fortress of lies. He thought he was safe because I was 1,000 miles away. He thought he could destroy my reputation to feed his greed. He was wrong. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my uniform. I picked up my cover, my combination cap, and placed it squarely under my arm. "Thank you, Pastor," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was steel. "You have cleared up the confusion. I can assure you, the charity stops today, and the truth comes out today." "Liana," he said, concern etching his brow, "what are you going to do?" "I'm going to correct the record," I said, "and I'm going to fix the mistake I made by trusting the wrong man." I turned and walked out of the office, leaving the smell of old books and pity behind. The morning air hit my face, cool and damp. I didn't feel the humidity anymore. I only felt the mission. I had the testimony. Now, I needed the paper trail. I needed to see exactly where $72,000 went, penny by penny. And I knew exactly where Harold kept his secrets. It was time to raid the command center. By noon, the house was finally silent. Harold and Mark had piled into the truck, loud and boisterous, heading to the Oak Haven Tavern to brag about a fishing trip where they hadn't caught a single thing. They left behind a cloud of exhaust and the quiet opportunity I'd been waiting for. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door to my father's home office. It was a solid oak door, the only one in the house that hadn't been battered or neglected. Taped to the center was a handwritten sign on cardboard. Private property. Keep out. It was the kind of sign a teenager puts up, but here it carried a genuine threat of violence. For a civilian, a locked door is a stop sign. For a naval officer trained in damage control and security protocols, a cheap interior privacy lock is a joke. I pulled a bobby pin from my hair and slipped a small penknife from my pocket. I knelt, inserted the tension tool, and raked the pin across the tumblers. It took less than 6 seconds. Click. The lock turned. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit by a wall of stale air. It smelled of unwashed laundry, old pizza boxes, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap Winston cigarettes. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. This was Harold's sanctuary, his man cave. The room was a pigsty, but in the center of the filth sat a shrine to modern technology. A massive curved gaming monitor, easily $1,000, glowed softly on a reinforced desk. Beside it was a high-end gaming PC tower with red LED lights pulsing like a heartbeat. I sat in his leather executive chair, which groaned under my weight. I woke the computer. A password prompt appeared. I didn't need to be a hacker to bypass this security. Stuck to the bottom of the monitor, on a bright yellow post-it note, was a scribbled code, King Harold 1960. The arrogance was breathtaking. I typed it in. The screen flashed to life. I opened the browser and went straight to the history. I wasn't looking for job applications or investment research. I knew better. The list that scrolled past my eyes made my stomach turn. Bet365, sports betting and odds, Pornhub. Premium, subscription active. Seeking arrangement, find your sugar baby today. I felt bile rise in my throat. Seeking arrangement. My father, a 60-year-old man living off his daughter's charity, was on a website pretending to be a wealthy benefactor to young women, likely college students who needed tuition money. He was playing the role of a millionaire while his wife ate expired beans. Focus, Liana, I whispered to myself. Get the numbers. I navigated to the bank's website. The browser auto-filled the login credentials. I clicked statements. I didn't just look at them. I sent the command to print the last 12 months. The laser printer in the corner whirred to life, a mechanical sound that seemed deafening in the quiet house. While the pages churned out, I watched the digital transaction log. The numbers weren't just data points, they were knife wounds. May 2nd. Oak Haven Guns and Ammo. $1,200. Mom had told me last week she was splitting her blood pressure pills in half because she couldn't afford the refill. Harold had bought a new rifle instead. May 5th. Dragon Warrior Game Store, $500. That was for Mark, $500 on virtual currency for a video game while the water bill sat unpaid on the kitchen table. May 10th, the Rose Motel, $300. My breath hitched. The Rose Motel was a seedy spot on the edge of the county, known for hourly rates. He wasn't just looking at girls online, he was meeting them. I scrolled further down. Dozens of transactions for $50, $75, $100, Chatterbait tokens, OnlyFans tips. I looked at the summary at the bottom of the screen. Every month, by the 25th, the balance was zero. There was no savings account. There was no rainy day fund. He burned through $72,000 a year on lust, gambling, and toys, leaving exactly nothing for electricity, heat, or food. I grabbed the stack of warm paper from the printer tray. This was it. This was the devil's ledger. It was undeniable proof of financial abuse and adultery. I was just reaching for the stapler when a sound froze the blood in my veins. Crunch. The distinctive sound of heavy tires rolling over gravel. I checked my watch. They had only been gone 40 minutes. Why were they back? The roar of the Ford F-150's V8 engine cut out abruptly just outside the window. A car door slammed. Then another. "I told you I forgot my wallet, you idiot." Harold's voice boomed from the front porch, muffled but clear. "Stop whining and get inside." I'm going, Mark yelled back. Heavy footsteps thumped onto the wooden porch. I was trapped. I shoved the stack of papers inside my uniform jacket, zipping it up to my chin. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of adrenaline. There was no back exit from this room. The window was painted shut. "Mark, go grab it off my desk," Harold shouted from the kitchen, "and grab me a beer while you're at it." Yeah, Mark muttered. The footsteps were in the hallway now, heavy, getting closer. I looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide. The closet was bursting with junk. Under the desk was too exposed. The doorknob to the office began to turn. The doorknob to the office jiggled, then stopped. It was locked, of course. For a split second, silence hung in the hallway, heavy and suffocating. "Damn it," Mark's voice muttered from the other side. "Dad, did you lock this?" "I don't remember," Harold shouted from the kitchen. "Just jiggle it, the latch sticks." I didn't wait. As Mark took a step back to likely throw his shoulder against the wood, I silently unlocked the mechanism from the inside, turned the handle, and slipped out, moving with the speed and silence of a ghost. I didn't head for the kitchen. I ducked immediately into the guest bathroom right next door and slammed the door shut just as Mark stumbled into the hallway. He spun around, startled by the noise. "Liana, what the hell are you doing lurking around?" I flushed the toilet to create a sonic cover and cracked the door open, feigning annoyance. "I'm handling some feminine business, Mark. Do you want a detailed report, or can you give me some privacy?" Mark's face twisted in immediate, predictable disgust. Like most men of his emotionally stunted variety, the mere mention of anything related to female biology was like kryptonite. "Gross. Keep it to yourself. Just stay out of Dad's way." He grumbled something about me being a moody spinster and disappeared into the office to fetch the wallet. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the close call. I could feel the stack of warm printer paper burning against my chest, inside my jacket. I waited until I heard the heavy thud of Mark's boots returning to the kitchen, followed by the crack of another beer can opening. "Now!" I moved to the kitchen doorway. Mom was wiping down the counter, her movements robotic and fearful. I walked up to her, grabbed her hand gently, and whispered, "Come with me." "Now." "Liana, I can't," she whispered back, eyes darting to the living room where the TV was blaring a football game. "Dinner." "Dinner can wait. This cannot." I pulled her, ignoring her weak resistance, and led her down the hall to my old bedroom. I ushered her inside and locked the door behind us. The room smelled like dust and memories. Faded posters of bands from the 90s still clung to the walls, a stark contrast to the war zone this house had become. "Liana, what is it?" Mom asked, rubbing her wrists. "If your father hears us whispering, he gets paranoid." I didn't say a word. I unzipped my jacket and pulled out the stack of papers, the devil's ledger. I spread them out on the faded chenille bedspread. "Look, Mom," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Don't look away. Read this." She squinted, leaning over the bed. "What is this?" "It's the truth," I said. "Look at the transactions." I pointed to the lines I had highlighted in my mind. May 2nd, $1,200 to Oak Haven Guns and Ammo. "You told me you couldn't afford your arthritis medication last week, Mom. He bought a rifle." She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. May 5th, I continued relentless. $500, that's for Mark's video game. That's $500 of my salary, going to a 34-year-old man's virtual sword while you eat beans. He said he was investing," she stammered, her voice thin and breaking. "He said the market was down." "Investments?" I let out a harsh, dry laugh. I pointed to the recurring charges for the Rose Motel. Since when do investments charge by the hour at a roadside motel, Mom? Her face went pale, draining of all color. She knew what the Rose Motel was. Everyone in Oakhaven knew. It was a place for secrets and sins. And this, I said, pointing to the line that hurt the most, seeking arrangement. Do you know what this website is? She shook her head, tears beginning to spill over. It's a website where old men pay young women for companionship, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He's using the money I send, money meant to keep a roof over your head, to pay for college girls to pretend they like him. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the muffled sounds of the football game from the other end of the house. Mom collapsed onto the edge of the bed. She didn't scream. She didn't wail. She just crumbled, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. It was the sound of 40 years of loyalty shattering against the cold, hard rock of reality. I tried to be a good wife, she choked out. I prayed. I saved every penny. I thought if I just suffered a little more, God would fix him. God sent me back to fix this, Mom, I said softly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the velvet box I had brought from the car. I opened it. The Mikimoto pearls glowed in the dim light, perfect and pure. Stand up, Mom. She stood, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I walked behind her and fastened the clasp around her thin, fragile neck. The cool weight of the pearls settled against her skin. I turned her to face the dusty mirror on the back of the door. Look at yourself, I commanded gently. This necklace is worth more than Mark's truck. I bought this for you. Not for a girl on the internet, not for a bartender at the Rose Motel. For you. She touched the pearls, her fingers trembling. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking at herself. He treats you like a servant, I said, meeting her eyes in the reflection. He treats you like a dog he can kick whenever he wants. But you are Elaine Ellis. You are my mother. And you are done being a victim. She took a shuddering breath. The fear was still there, lurking behind her eyes. The fear of a woman who had been conditioned to be small. But beneath it, sparked by the truth I had just laid bare, was something else. Anger. He lied to me, she whispered. He let me beg for food. Yes, I said. Do you want to live like this until you die? Do you want to starve so he can play? She closed her eyes, gripping the pearls. When she opened them, the tears had stopped. No, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. I'm tired, Liana. I'm so tired. I know, I said, putting my hands on her shoulders. Tonight, we end it. I will do the talking. I will take the heat. You just need to stand behind me. Can you do that? She looked at the bank statements on the bed, then at the pearls around her neck. She nodded. I can do that. I squeezed her shoulders. The alliance was formed. The hostage had been armed. Good, I said. Then wipe your face, Mom. We have a dinner to attend. The air in the dining room was thick enough to choke on, smelling of roasted grease and impending violence. On the center of the table sat a plastic container holding a rotisserie chicken from Costco, its lid torn off. Harold and Mark were tearing into the meat like starving wolves, grease glistening on their chins, discarding the bones onto their plates with wet, smacking sounds. My mother sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, fingering the cool beads of the Mikimoto pearls. She hadn't touched her food. She was waiting for the signal. Harold wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and let out a loud, unapologetic belch. He pointed a greasy drumstick at Mom. See, Elaine, that's what real food tastes like. If you weren't so stingy with the grocery budget, we could eat like this every night. Don't know why you insist on hoarding pennies. He tossed the bone onto the pile, pushed his chair back, and started to stand. All right, game time. Mark, grab me another beer. Sit down, I said. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I used my command voice, the tone I used on the bridge of a warship during a storm. It was deep, resonant, and brooked absolutely no argument. Harold froze halfway out of his chair. He looked at me, blinking, as if he couldn't believe the sound had come from his daughter. Excuse me, who do you think you're talking to? I said, sit down, Harold. The use of his first name hit him like a slap. He sank slowly back into his chair, his face reddening. "You watch your tone, girl. I am the man of this house." "Not anymore," I said. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the stack of papers, the Devil's Ledger. I threw them into the center of the table. They landed with a heavy slap right next to the carcass of the chicken. "Explain this," I demanded, line by line. Harold glanced at the papers. Even upside down, the logos for Oakhaven Guns and Ammo and Seeking Arrangement were visible. His face went from red to a sickly shade of gray. Mark reached for the stack. "What is this? You snooping in Dad's office, you little—" "Touch those papers, Mark, and you'll be eating through a straw," I said, locking eyes with him. My gaze was lethal. Mark shrank back, his hand retreating. He was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward when faced with a superior force. I turned my attention back to my father. "You told the church I abandoned you so you could get free beans. You let your wife beg for food. Meanwhile, you spent $72,000 in 12 months. On guns, on video games for your 34-year-old son, and on women." I pointed a finger at him, an accusation sharp as a bayonet. "You aren't a provider, Harold. You are a parasite. You have fed off my labor and Mom's dignity for 40 years. "You shut your mouth," Harold roared. The shame was too much for his fragile ego. He exploded, kicking his chair back so hard it crashed to the floor. He lunged across the corner of the table, his heavy hand raised to strike me, a reflex he had used to silence the women in this house for decades. But I wasn't Elaine Ellis, and I wasn't 12 years old. As his hand came down, I didn't flinch. I stepped into the strike, intercepting his wrist with my left hand while my right hand clamped onto his elbow. With a fluid motion drilled into me by years of close-quarters combat training, I twisted. I applied just enough torque to lock the joint. Harold screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and pain, as I forced his arm behind his back and slammed his chest down onto the table, right next to the chicken grease. "Don't you ever," I hissed, leaning close to his ear, "think about touching me or my mother again." I applied a fraction more pressure. He whimpered. "I am a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy," I whispered. "I am not your punching bag, and neither is she." Mark had scrambled out of his chair, pressing his back against the refrigerator, eyes wide with terror. He made no move to help. I know everyone listening has wanted to do this to a bully at least once in their life. If you are cheering for Liana right now, smash that like button. And tell me in the comments, type justice, if you think Harold deserved even worse than a twisted arm. I want to see 1,000 justice comments right now. I released Harold, shoving him back into his chair. He rubbed his shoulder, wheezing, looking at me with pure fear. I pulled out my phone and set it on the table. I dialed the number for Chase Bank's fraud department and hit the speakerphone button. The ringing sound echoed in the silent kitchen. "Chase Bank, fraud department," a polite female voice answered. "Yes, this is Liana Ellis," I said, staring dead at my father. "Account ending in 4492. I am the primary account holder." "Security verified, Ms. Ellis. How can I help you?" "I need to report unauthorized use on the secondary card issued to Harold Ellis," I said clearly. "I want that card canceled immediately. Permanent block. And I want to initiate a fraud investigation into the transactions made in the last year." Harold's jaw dropped. "No. Liana, wait. You can't." "Done," the agent said cheerfully. "The card has been deactivated. Is there anything else?" "That's all. Thank you." Click. The silence that followed was deafening. The lifeline was cut. The free ride was over. Harold stared at the phone, his hands shaking. You killed me," he stammered. "How am I supposed to buy gas? How am I supposed to eat? I'll sue you. I have rights." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the cold satisfaction of a mission accomplished. "You have hands, Harold," I said, picking up the stack of evidence. "And there are plenty of help-wanted signs in town." Welcome to reality. The court has reached a verdict. The silence in the kitchen following the disconnect tone was heavier than the humid air outside. It was the silence of a power vacuum. Harold sat slumped in his chair, the color draining from his face until it matched the gray of cigarette ash. The bluster, the shouting, the physical intimidation, It had all evaporated the moment the money supply was cut. He didn't lung at me again. Instead, he shrank. His shoulders hunched and his face twisted into a mask of pathetic suffering. "Liana," he wheezed, clutching his chest theatrically. "You're killing me. You know I have high blood pressure. You know my heart isn't good. You come into my house and try to give your own father a stroke." It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times, but tonight the theater was closed. I didn't even look at him. I turned to my mother, who was still standing by the table, her hand clutching the pearls I had just given her. "Mom," I said, my voice leaving no room for debate. "Go to the bedroom. Pack a bag. Only the essentials. Clothes, your social security card, your driver's license. Leave everything else. We are leaving. Now." She nodded, a jerky, frightened movement, and turned toward the hallway. Suddenly, Mark scrambled away from the refrigerator, blocking the doorway with his bulky frame. His panic was real, but it wasn't born of love. "Wait, where is she going?" Mark demanded, his eyes darting between me and the dirty dishes on the table. "She can't leave. Who's going to make breakfast tomorrow? Who's going to wash the laundry? I have a pile of clothes in the hallway she hasn't touched yet." The words hung in the air, naked and ugly. I stepped into his personal space, forcing him to take a step back. "She is your mother, Mark. Not your maid. Not your appliance. Move." Mark hesitated, looking at Harold for backup. But Harold was too busy feeling sorry for himself. I shoved past Mark, leading Mom into the bedroom. We moved fast. It was a tactical extraction. I grabbed a small duffel bag from the closet and started tossing in the shirts and pants. Mom moved slower, her hands trembling as she picked up a framed photo of us from the dresser. "Leave it," I said gently. "We'll make new memories. Don't take anything that carries the smell of this house." She put the photo down. We zipped the bag. As we walked back into the kitchen, Harold was waiting. He had switched tactics again. The anger was gone, the medical emergency was forgotten. Now, he was the heartbroken lover. He rushed forward, grabbing Mom's hand before I could intercept him. "Elaine, baby, please," he begged, his voice cracking with a desperate, oily sweetness. "You can't just walk out. We've been married 40 years. 40 years. You swore an oath before God." Mom froze. The guilt, conditioned into her for decades, flared up in her eyes. "I can change," Harold continued, sensing her hesitation. He squeezed her hand. "I'll stop the gambling. I'll stop the websites. I promise. Just don't leave me here alone. I need you, Elaine. I love you." It was classic love bombing, the last-ditch effort of an abuser losing control. I stepped forward to physically separate them, but Mom raised her free hand to stop me. She looked at Harold. She looked at his teary, bloodshot eyes. Then she looked around the kitchen, at the peeling paint, the unpaid bills, the empty refrigerator, and the rotisserie chicken grease congealing on the table. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled her hand from his grip. She reached for her left hand. With a twist, she slid off her wedding ring. It was a plain, thin gold band, worn down by decades of scrubbing floors and washing dishes. It was the only thing of value he had ever given her, and even that had been a shackle. She didn't hand it to him. She placed it gently on the table, right next to a puddle of chicken grease. "I am not leaving you because I don't love you, Harold," she said, her voice quiet but steady, echoing the strength of the pearls around her neck. "I am leaving because I need to find the woman I was before I met you." The statement was soft, but it hit Harold with the force of a freight train. He stood there, mouth open, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He had no defense against the truth. "Let's go, Mom," I said. I picked up the duffel bag with one hand and wrapped my other arm around her shoulders. We walked past Harold, who was now just a statue of a defeated tyrant. We reached the back door. Mark was standing there, leaning against the doorframe, looking lost. For the first time, the reality was sinking in. The ATM was closed, the cook was leaving, the maid was quitting. He looked at me with a mix of hatred and helplessness. "What are we supposed to do?" I paused, my hand on the screen door. I looked at my brother, 34 years old, able-bodied, yet completely useless. "I saw a sign in town on my way in," I said, my voice cool and sharp. "The Ace Hardware store is hiring stock boys. $12 an hour. You start at the bottom, Mark. Good luck. I pushed the door open. We stepped out into the night air. It was still humid, but away from the house, the air felt cleaner. I helped Mom into the passenger seat of my rental SUV. I threw the bag in the back and climbed into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The kitchen light was still on. Through the window, I could see two shadows standing amidst the mess they had created, small and insignificant. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away, the gravel crunching under the tires one last time. Beside me, Mom let out a long, shuddering breath. Then she covered her face with her hands and began to cry. But these weren't the fearful, stifled sobs of the woman hiding a can of beans. They were loud, heaving sobs of relief. We left the rotting house behind, driving toward the highway, toward the lights of the next town, toward a life that finally belonged to her. The lease signing at Pineview Senior Living took less than 30 minutes. It was a quiet, clean complex 2 towns over, close enough to her church, but far enough from the toxic crater of her old life to be safe. When I unlocked the door to Unit 2B, the smell hit us first. It didn't smell of mildew, stale beer, or despair. It smelled of fresh latex paint and the lavender cleaning solution the management used. Sunlight streamed through the sliding glass balcony doors, flooding the living room with a warmth that felt almost foreign after the gloom of the old house. It's all for me, Mom whispered, stepping onto the plush beige carpet. She looked terrified to touch anything, as if she might break the spell. It's all yours, Mom, I said, dropping the keys on the granite countertop. Utilities are included. No more red envelopes, no more shut-off notices. I led her to the kitchen. It wasn't huge, but it was modern. I walked over to the stainless steel, double-door refrigerator and pulled it open. It was empty now, but the light was bright and the shelves were clean glass, waiting to be filled. Let's go shopping, I said. An hour later, we were pushing a cart through the aisles of the local Whole Foods. For 40 years, my mother had shopped with a calculator in her head, terrified of going over a budget that Harold drank away anyway. She instinctively reached for the dented cans, the generic brands, the meat that was marked down because it was about to expire. Mom, I said gently, taking a package of graying ground beef out of her hand and putting it back. Stop. I guided her to the butcher counter. We aren't eating scrap meat anymore. You like steak, right? Oh, Liana, steak is too expensive, she fretted, looking at the price tag. Ribeyes are $15 a pound. Get 2, I told the butcher. Thick cut. We filled the cart. Fresh organic spinach, expensive almond milk, a carton of cage-free eggs, a box of Belgian chocolates. By the time we reached the checkout lane, the cart was overflowing with color and life. At the register, as the cashier scanned the items, Mom started to fumble with her old, worn-out coin purse, her hands shaking. She was looking for coupons, counting pennies out of habit. Put that away, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a brand new debit card I'd opened that morning. It was a bright, shimmering blue. I handed it to her. Read the name, Mom. She squinted at the embossed letters. Elaine Ellis. There is $2,000 in that account for this month, I said, loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough to keep it private. This is your money. For your food. For your clothes. You don't ask me for permission, and you certainly don't ask Harold. She held the card like it was a holy relic. 2,000. Liana, I don't know if I can. You can, I smiled. Swipe it. She stepped up to the terminal. She inserted the chip. A moment later, the machine let out a cheerful beep. Approved. The sound was small, but to me, it sounded like a cannon shot. It was the sound of shackles falling off. She looked at the screen, then at me, and a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes, finally broke through. She had control. I stayed for another month, extending my leave to ensure the transition stuck. And the transformation I witnessed was nothing short of miraculous. It started with the hair. The gray frizzy bun she wore to make herself invisible was gone. In its place was a chic, chestnut-colored bob that took 10 years off her face. She bought new clothes, slacks that fit, blouses that weren't gray or brown. One morning, I found her in the community center, sitting on a yoga mat with 3 other ladies, laughing as they tried to hold a pose. She wasn't the scared, trembling victim I had found in the dark kitchen. She was Elaine. She was a woman with friends, with a home, and with a future. But the universe demands balance. While Mom was rising, the old house was sinking. I got the news from Mrs. Gable, the nosy neighbor who lived across the street from the old place. I met her at the post office, and she couldn't wait to spill the tea. "It's a disaster over there, Liana," Mrs. Gable whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. "The power went out 3 days ago. Harold was screaming in the front yard, blaming the electric company, blaming the government. But we all know he just didn't pay the bill." I listened, my face impassive. "And the fighting," she continued, shaking her head. "Mark and Harold are at each other's throats all day, screaming about money, screaming about food. It sounds like a pack of wild dogs." Then she dropped the final piece of news. "And that big truck, the Ford? The repo man came for it yesterday morning, hooked it up and dragged it away while Harold stood on the porch in his underwear, crying." "Is that so?" I said coolly. "They're living in their own filth," Mrs. Gable tisked. "Serves them right, if you ask me. They treated your mother like a servant." I walked back to my car, feeling a strange, cold sense of peace. I didn't feel happy about their suffering, but I didn't feel guilty either. I had removed the victim. Without a host to feed on, the parasites were simply consuming each other. It wasn't revenge, it was just consequences. I drove back to Pine View, where the lights were on, the fridge was full, and my mother was safe. A week before I was scheduled to return to Norfolk, the doorbell rang at Unit 2B. It was a Tuesday afternoon, humid and lazy. Mom and I were sitting on the small balcony, drinking iced tea and watching the traffic pass on the highway below. We weren't expecting visitors. The only people who knew where we lived were the pastor and Mrs. Gable, and neither of them would show up unannounced. I walked to the door, checking the peephole out of habit. The figure distorted by the fisheye lens looked familiar, but wrong. The posture was slumped. The clothes were dark and stained. I opened the door, but I kept the chain latch engaged, leaving only a 3-inch gap. "Liana?" It was Mark. But it wasn't the Mark I had left in the kitchen a month ago. That Mark had been boisterous, overweight, and smug, dragging a $300 cooler. This Mark looked like he had been chewed up and spit out by a trash compactor. He was wearing a dark blue mechanic's jumpsuit that was stained black with grease and oil. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow. He held a cheap red mesh bag of navel oranges in one hand, the kind you buy for $3 at a discount grocery store. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked through the crack. He flinched at the sharpness of my tone. He didn't try to push the door open. He didn't make a joke. He just held up the oranges. I brought these for Mom," he mumbled, his voice raspy. "I know she likes fruit. It's not much, but..." Mom appeared behind me. I saw her instinct to open the door, to feed him, to comfort him. It was the motherly reflex hardwired into her DNA, but I held up a hand to stop her. Mark needed to learn, and he couldn't learn if we cushioned his fall. "Where are you working?" I asked, looking at the grime embedded deep under his fingernails. "The tire shop down on Route 9, Mark said, looking at his boots. "I'm changing oil and hauling tires. The foreman?" "He yells at me like I'm a dog, Liana. 8 hours a day, $12 an hour. My back is killing me." He looked up, and his eyes were rimmed with red. "It's hard. I come home and I'm too tired to even shower sometimes. I just eat a frozen dinner and pass out." "That's called a job, Mark," I said coldly. "Most of us have been doing it for years." "I know," he whispered. A tear cut a clean track through the grease on his cheek. "I know that now. Listen, I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. Without Mom there, the house is hell. Dad just drinks and screams at the TV. There's no food, there's no clean clothes. I didn't realize how much she did. Hunger and exhaustion are excellent teachers. They had taught Mark in 4 weeks what I couldn't teach him in a lifetime." "Leave the oranges," I said. "We accept the apology. But you aren't moving in here, Mark. You stay at the tire shop. You keep working. Maybe in a year you'll be a man worth knowing." I closed the door. Mom picked up the bag of oranges he had left on the mat. She held them to her chest for a moment, looking sad. but she didn't unlock the latch. The next day, I drove past the old house one last time. It was a painful sight. In just over a month, the property had deteriorated from neglected to abandoned. The lawn, which Mom used to nag Harold to mow, was now knee-high, a jungle of dandelions and crabgrass. A front window was broken, likely from a rage-thrown bottle, and covered with a piece of cardboard. And there, sitting on the front porch in the rocking chair, was Harold. It was 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, but he was sitting in the shadows, rocking slowly back and forth. A bottle of cheap bourbon sat on the floorboards beside him. He looked small. The bluster was gone. The arrogance was gone. Without an audience to intimidate and a victim to control, a tyrant is just a lonely old man. He saw my rental SUV slow down. He stopped rocking. He leaned forward, squinting, trying to see if it was salvation coming back up the driveway. I didn't turn in. I kept my foot on the gas, watching him shrink in the rearview mirror until he was just a speck of darkness against the gray siding of the rotting house. He was the king of nothing, ruling over a kingdom of dust. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I looked down. The screen flashed a picture of Harold, a photo from years ago, when he looked happier before I knew the truth. Incoming call. Dad. I looked at Mom in the passenger seat. She saw the screen. She saw the name. For a second, the old fear flickered in her eyes, but then she looked at her new haircut in the visor mirror. She touched the pearls at her throat. She looked at the road ahead, stretching out toward the airport and away from Oak Haven. She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "I have nothing left to say to him." I picked up the phone. I didn't answer. I pressed the red button to decline the call. Then I opened the contact settings. I scrolled down to the bottom, past the phone numbers and the email addresses, to the red text at the very end. Block this caller. I tapped it. A confirmation box popped up. You will not receive phone calls, messages, or FaceTime from people on the block list. I tapped block contact. The phone went silent. The connection was severed. There would be no more lies, no more guilt trips, no more manipulation. We drove on in silence, leaving the past to rot in the overgrown weeds of Kentucky, while the highway ahead opened up wide and free. The Bluegrass Airport in Lexington buzzed with the chaotic energy of travelers, but as I walked through the terminal, the crowd seemed to part. I wasn't wearing my working khakis today. I was wearing my service dress whites, the high collar, the gleaming gold buttons, the pristine fabric that demanded respect. Beside me walked Liana Ellis. She didn't look like the woman I'd found cowering in a dark kitchen a month ago. She walked with her head high, her new chestnut hair catching the terminal lights. Around her neck, the Mikimoto pearls glowed softly, a testament to her reclaimed dignity. When we reached the security checkpoint, I turned to her. In the past, this was the moment she would have crumbled, clinging to me, weeping about how lonely the house would be without me. Today, she just smiled. It was a calm, steady smile. "Go on, Lieutenant Commander," she said, her voice clear. "The Navy needs you back." "Are you sure you're going to be okay, Mom?" I asked, searching her eyes for any trace of the old fear. She took my hands in hers. Her grip was warm and firm. "I'm not just okay, Liana. I'm free. I have my church, I have my friends, and for the first time in 40 years, I have myself." She squeezed my hand. "And I have the Lord. He walked me through the valley of the shadow of death, and he brought me out the other side." I hugged her, breathing in the scent of her lavender shampoo. It smelled like peace. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, my warrior," she whispered. I turned and walked through the checkpoint. I didn't look back with sadness. I looked back with pride. I had completed the most difficult mission of my career, but I hadn't just saved one woman. Before I drove to the airport, I'd made one final stop at Oak Haven United Methodist Church. The memory played in my mind as I boarded the plane. I saw Pastor Reynolds sitting in his office, the same room where I had learned the ugly truth about my father's lies. This time, however, I wasn't there to demand answers. I had placed a check on his desk. It was for a significant amount, a large portion of the savings I had intended to use for a down payment on a house for myself. "What is this, Liana?" the pastor had asked, staring at the number. "This is seed money," I told him. "I want to establish a permanent fund in this church. Call it the Elaine Fund. And its purpose? It is specifically for legal aid and emergency financial assistance for women in this parish who are victims of domestic or financial abuse," I said. "I want there to be a safety net. If a woman in Oak Haven is afraid to leave her husband because she can't buy groceries or hire a lawyer, this fund pays for it. No questions asked, no judgment passed." The pastor had taken off his glasses, his eyes shining with emotion. "Liana, this will save lives." "That's the point, Pastor," I said, standing to leave. "Don't let anyone else eat charity beans in the dark. Not on my watch." Back in the present, the jet engines roared to life, pressing me back into my seat. The plane taxied to the runway and began its ascent. As the ground fell away, I looked out the window. The rolling green hills of Kentucky spread out below like a quilt. Somewhere down there, in that vast landscape, was a rotting house with overgrown grass, where a lonely old man sat in the dark with his bottle. I felt a twinge of phantom pain, the ache of a daughter who had lost her father. But it was fleeting. The plane punched through a layer of clouds, breaking into the brilliant, blinding sunshine of the upper atmosphere. I realized then that the hardest war I would ever fight wasn't against foreign insurgents or hostile fleets. It was the war against the injustice within my own bloodline. It was the battle to accept that the people who are supposed to love us are sometimes the ones who hurt us the most. I had lost a father, yes, but I had saved a mother. And in doing so, I had saved a part of myself that I didn't know was dying. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. The words of John, chapter 8, verse 32, drifted through my mind, clearer than ever before. "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." The truth had been painful. It had been ugly. It had cost me money and heartache, but it had shattered the chains. As I watched the white clouds drift by, I finally understood the real meaning of family. It isn't just about blood or history. It shouldn't be a shield to protect cruelty, nor an obligation to endure pain. True family is a sanctuary of safety, not a prison of fear. Justice isn't just found in a courtroom with a gavel. It is found in the quiet, difficult choices we make to protect the vulnerable. It is in the courage to say no more, even when the bully shares your last name. My name is Lieutenant Commander Liana Ellis, and this was my justice. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my journey, it is this. Financial abuse is a silent epidemic, and it thrives in the darkness of our silence. We often fear offending our family members more than we fear their betrayal. But please remember, protecting your hard-earned resources and the dignity of those you love is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of survival. Check on your elderly parents. Ask the hard questions about their finances. Don't let politeness become a prison. Setting a boundary is not an act of war. Sometimes it is the only path to peace. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice to cut off a toxic family member to save yourself or someone you love? It is a heavy decision, but you shouldn't have to carry it alone. Share your story in the comments below. Let's turn this comment section into a support group for survivors. If you believe that justice was served today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell more stories that need to be heard. Until next time, stay strong and stay vigilant.